It would be wildly understating the point to say the Gundam is an iconic giant robot design, because at this point, if you can't recognize the Gundam silhouette across its many iterations, you're probably not paying very close attention. Or you're taking this audiovisual medium in without the visuals, I suppose, but working under the conceit that you're able to perceive the world around you in the manner that the creators intended, you probably know a Gundam on sight. But what good is a giant robot if it doesn't have something to punch up every episode? Enter the humble Zaku, a mass-production mobile suit that does nearly as much, if not more, heavy lifting for the franchise than the title machine. So, take a walk with me on this one, will you? So let's talk about design first. What is it that makes the Zaku stand out? Well, in its first outing, we get to see, before anything else, its iconic mono eye. A black void with a single point of pink light. This zooms out to a drab, green, gas mask-like face with a stocky, aggressive form. Its asymmetry immediately marks it out as something somewhat primitive and dangerous at the same time as the three Zakus deploy into Side 7. It's green. It's heavy-looking. In contrast to the Gundam, which has bright colors and a very heroic bearing, almost like a man in armor. The Zaku is barrel-chested and lumbering, lacking a face to connect with, unlike the Gundam's masked visage. This is the enemy, capital T, capital E. There's a distinct divorce between human and non-human that happens in our brains when we see something like this. The Gundam is an armored human, for the most part. The Zaku is other. It has no face and one big eye. No mouth, but a ventilator. It has no expression or emotion, simply one staring eye, looking out from a black void. The only emotion you get from it is when it is in motion and aiming and specifically glaring at you. Same with the Dom and the Gyan, though the Goof and the Gelgoog are quite angry in their own aspect. This stylistic quirk would be used to further keep the baddie mobile suits firmly in the realm of the other for the remainder of the series. The Zaku chassis itself is utilitarian, not requiring much in the way of changes for the Zaku 1 and Zaku 2, and even the Goof.
This is no Zaku, boy! No Zaku!
And once Char's red Zaku comes into the fray with a big red command horn, it suddenly becomes clear what these things are. If the Gundam is a samurai, and it certainly is, then the Zeon mobile suits are yokai of a sort. This is not a perfect comparison, mind you, but the one-horned, axe-wielding red Oni and the one-horned, sword-wielding blue Oni, both with the same sort of loincloth-esque hip armor, does seem to indicate this sort of design philosophy. Looking at it like this, we can see the undercurrent of Japan facing its demons in a somewhat literal way. The Gundam is our hero, the crystallization of a Japanese paragon. The Zeon are the Oni, the monsters that keep challenging said paragon, who in addition to this are saddled with fascist imagery from World War II. This is the Zaku's legacy. It is a challenge to the Japanese sense of self, a bugbear that no matter how many beam weapons pierce their steel hides, they can never truly be rid of. That's why the Zaku is always shown so prominently and in force, and why the design refuses to die. So, taking this idea to its next step, the next level of development, we have the Zaku. The Zaku II, updated to the current standards of 0087, the Zaku remains extant and a part of forces that challenge our heroes, who are struggling again under a shifting paradigm. The world of Zeta Gundam is very much like the occupation of Japan, where those same bugbears kept showing up, except they're given a new coat of paint. They were collaborators with the occupying forces, represented by the Federation forces that were once the heroes, but their veneer fell away and the AU had to rise to oppose them. Fair warning, this is not a new read on Gundam, by the way. Gundam is to World War II what Aliens is to the Vietnam War for America. It's something where we realized that something went terribly wrong, but we were in too deep to pull out of it, sort of thing. And we can unpack that more in a different video, but going back to it, similarly in Double Zeta, they followed the same role, though much more violently. The Zaku and Dovenwolf are once again the sins of the past haunting the present. It would not be until Char's counterattack that we see this sense of the past further weaponized with the Gira Doga, the Neo-Zeon forces using it to force something of a final reckoning between everything that had come before and the modern era trying to assert itself. In this, Char is the militarized forces of Japan coming back and trying to exert their will on a populace that had been pretty well done with warfare. But there's just one more obstacle to get over, and that's represented by the asteroid axis. It could be argued that the Denon Zan, fielded by the Crossbone Vanguard, is a much less Japanese other and a much more generalized other, but it also has much more heavy influences of German wargear than the classic Zaku II. Not that the Zaku was lacking for that manner of influence, but the Denon Zan and the rest of the Crossbone Vanguard unit are less of a Japan versus itself issue and more of an entrenched aristocracy versus everyone else issue. Likewise, the enemy mobiles in Victory Gundam are more humanoid, with much less of an ideological battle happening on a subtextual level than with the Zaku. No less imposing, even more intimidating to be clear, but much less of an existential threat and much more of a traditional threat. So let's kick it over to the AUs real quick, and the grunt units are at a similar level here. The Death Army is very loudly and angrily an Oni, considering its weapons layout, the little horn on its head. However, instead of an expressionless eye, it has an eye that is very much glaring at you. Whether this is silly or terrifying largely depends on which side of the screen you're on. The Leo, on the other hand, swings wildly the other direction. The Leo takes the faceless grunt idea to a whole new level, having literally no face and just a camera. However, it's also very much a modern military style of unit over the other ones, with a very versatile chassis and wide array of weaponry. It is, in a sense, the poor bloody infantry, with very little in the way of distinguishing features. They are mass production units sent into the fangs of the Gundam to prove how powerful the Gundams are. The Genis in Gundam X is the Zaku with a mustache, mirroring the strange way that show was mimicking the Universal Century timeline crossed with Mad Max. And speaking of mustaches, Turn A just features slightly redesigned Zakus. In this, the idea of weapons from the past wreaking havoc on the otherwise peaceful present very much fits in with the Zaku's representation here. These Turn A level Zakus are sort of like pulling out your pappy's service rifle to defend the farm. The significance of the Zaku is kind of lost in Turn A, much like the significance of what that old beat-up rifle was used for in its heyday, but visually it still got the same oeuvre that it did when it was still factory fresh. Gundam Seed is a little bit odd because the Jins are much more flashy and fashy Zakus, but then they just bring back the Zaku for some reason, mostly out of a desperation to recapture the original Gundam's feeling without really understanding why it worked. Gundam Double O has a chunky, quote-unquote realistic Zaku that's a lot more indicative of the block that's using it and their tech level compared to the other nations. The Terran is over a decade old in the show. It's a relic of the past, which is fitting into the idea again, but it's also being used to needle the Chinese block. Shocker, I know, the Japanese taking jabs at China, unheard of. The graze is an interesting iteration on the Zaku because it's much more design-wise in line with a Leo, but it's also much more of a threat because it spends much of the early episodes of Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans fighting other grazes or mobile workers. But it's definitely carrying a tradition onwards, even if it's just in paint scheme.
Oh, and getting completely bodied. Now, some of you may be wondering about G-Reco and Gundam Age, and I have to say that given both their distance in time and tone from the original Gundam, and their lack of a really compelling Zaku analog, I'm just going to give them a pass. I mean, it's not like you guys cared that much about them anyway, right? Right?
It would appear that, overall, Gundam needs the Zaku or the Zaku analog to give it its efficacy. If Gundam was just another super robot that fought mostly forgettable monsters, and boy did it fall foul of that on occasion, then people would not likely have the fondness for it that they do even 40 years on. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that without the Zaku there is no Gundam, and, well, frankly, that's about all there is to say on this matter. So, hug a Zaku, I guess? If you're considering making your own mecha, what is at the core the ideological idea that you are battling against? And how do you represent that in your mecha designs? All I can really say is that if it worked for Gundam, it may work for you too. That being said, this is Professor Otaku, the greatest American anime critic, signing off.